Hi guys, welcome to the Discipline Life podcast, the place where we talk about power differential relationships and domestic discipline. I'm Arya and this is my husband Coda.
Hello.
And welcome to our first episode. On this episode, we're going to be talking about how to introduce domestic discipline into your relationship.
Indeed.
So I think we're going to start with talking about how we did that in our relationship. So do you remember that conversation?
A little bit. I probably should say that I remember it better, but honestly, because we've been doing this so long, I think I've kind of forgotten a little bit about what that conversation was like.
Right, because we've been doing, we've had a power differential relationship pretty much our whole relationship. Would you agree with that?
Yeah.
And so we've been married for 15 years and we started having a intentional power differential relationship, I want to say about 5 or 6 years ago.
Yeah.
Does that sound about right?
Has it been that long?
It has,
Wow.
but we didn't start introducing spanking or using the term domestic discipline to describe our relationship until about 3 years ago.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, that's true. That's about right.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I can't believe that's been that long, too.
It has. And so do you remember, because we had just moved and we were talking about our relationship because we were trying to have this power differential relationship where you had authority and I was coming under that authority, and we were having a really hard time with that. Do you remember?
Yes. Yeah. We could say we had somewhat of a learning curve.
Yes, absolutely. And do you remember why we had that learning curve?
Well, okay, it probably would be best if I said it from my point of view, and then maybe you can put in what you were thinking. But I can tell you, I think yes, one of the reasons I had an issue or was having problems was because our relationship hadn't worked that way at first, and so I was getting used to this new dynamic in our relationship of really taking more of that lead, being more. I don't want to use the word in charge.
Well, why not?
Okay, well, so maybe that is the word that I need to use, but I think. I was getting used to that because that had not been the way our relationship had been up to that point. So my big thing was, okay, where do I take the lead? Where do I not? Where do I draw the lines, really?
Well, and I would say that I think that up to that point you had been in charge, but not in a tangible way. You know, we always had the understanding of having these traditional roles, right? But it was more of you were leading by committee, not by a place of actual authority.
Yeah,
and that was
more
the
of a
shift.
Democracy.
Right. And that was the real shift was, you know, I don't get to have input on every single decision that you make anymore. And that was the real shift.
Yeah, that's true.
And so when we started shifting, we started that learning curve, we at first did not want to include spanking, if you remember.
Yeah. Oh, because was it because I was a little afraid to do that? I actually can't remember.
I think it's because we had been using spanking as a sexual fetish at that point in our relationship, and you did not want to blur the lines between play and punishment.
That's right. Yep.
And I think you were afraid of using physical force as punishment at first.
Well, and part of that I think was because of how I had only seen it used in my childhood.
Which most people, that's
right.
Most people, that is like where they draw their worldview from is what they experience in childhood.
Yeah, and so, gosh, and I didn't have a healthy relationship with that from my childhood, so that was all I had to go on. And I didn't realize there was a positive side to this, which there is, very much so.
Right. And I mean, adult spanking and spanking within domestic discipline is very, very different than parent child interrelationships.
Yes, yes, but obviously only coming from that. That's obviously the only pinpoint that I had
Oh, for
for that.
sure. And so I remember we really spent like a good 2 years trying to have these rules and punishments and rewards, and none of it included anything physical.
No.
And that was really difficult. Do you remember kind of going back to that time period, why that was so difficult for you?
Yeah, because I didn't really feel like the way I feel now is I feel like because we have and tell me if I'm going into too much before we get to this on another episode. But now that we've set this up with like a tier system, because we didn't have something like that, and we also didn't have spanking. Boy, it was really hard to enforce enforce the rules and do it effectively and not come off looking like a jerk. And on top of that, and also I could feel the frustration from you because I was not enforcing things that you wanted to enforce, and you didn't, and so you're frustrated with me because I'm not doing my part, and I'm frustrated with you because I feel like I couldn't because of the way it was structured. And it was just a huge mess all the way around.
I completely agree with the your point of it being very difficult to enforce, because I know at that point I was a stay-at-home mom,
Yep.
stay-at-home wife, and you worked a full-time job, so you were out of the house most days for the majority of the day. And so if I had broken a rule or not met an expectation, you would say, okay, you're not allowed to, do this certain thing or have this certain thing. There was no way for you to know. There was no way. And if I didn't abide by that, there was no more serious consequence.
Not without me setting cameras up, which, by the way, I didn't do.
No,
I didn't
no.
do for our the audience listening. But
Because
there
that's
would have been
invasive.
no. Well, yes, but there was no there. Yeah, you're right, because without doing that, there was no way for me to know. I just had to take your word for it that you didn't. And I don't know how many times did you actually sneak.
All the
Something when I
time.
told you?
All the time. Because there was no threat of a more serious consequence, and there was no way for you to know. And how many times did we set something up as a reward and you would give it to me without me actually having to earn it?
Gosh, yeah, a lot.
All the time.
Yes.
And that's when we realized that rewards didn't necessarily, like small little rewards, like per rule, didn't really work either, because you like to treat me and you don't want to have certain things be contingent on my behavior. There's certain aspects of my life that are just privileges of our marriage, not
in our relationship. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's not conditional.
Yeah.
And so that was really what led me to having the really hard conversation that I was really apprehensive to have, because I didn't know how you would take it. And that was, we had just moved and we were reevaluating our dynamic. We both realized how much things were not working. And I very apprehensively said, well, would you consider using spanking as a consequence, as a punishment?
Yep. I do remember that conversation.
And it wasn't an immediate yes, but it wasn't an immediate no.
No, because and I can tell you from, I don't know what your point of view was. I mean, obviously, I guess you were okay with it because you're the ones that suggested it again. But I can tell you from my point of view, I was fine. Like, well, we've tried everything else. we've done. Yeah, we tried everything else. We've done this from so many different angles. What's the worst that could happen? This doesn't work, and we have to try something else.
Now, before I brought that conversation up, I had been doing, at that point, probably years, but really more concentrated. I had for the previous 6 months really been doing a lot of reading and a lot of research on domestic discipline blogs. And I think it was that conversation. Yes, it was. It was that conversation
Yeah.
that I told you that this really isn't a DS, dominant, submissive, power exchange relationship. This really, what our relationship fit into better was the term domestic discipline.
Yeah.
And I led you to some resources that I found that were really solid.
Yes.
And I think a couple of them were a little overwhelming because they were so detailed.
Yeah, but that honestly, even though it was a lot of information to take, it was good from the standpoint that I got to have a lot of information up front.
And so I remember giving you some information to read, and you took about a week? You took a week to really read that information.
Well, yeah, because it was a lot, and I wanted some time to think about it.
Right. And so, I mean, I gave you, I think, 3 different blog resources and several articles within each of those resources to read and look at. And I told you, not every single thing that each of these resources says is going to fit our relationship.
Mm-hmm.
It is okay to take the information and sift through and see what we want to incorporate and also what we want to discard from that.
Yep.
So after a week, we sat down again, and do you remember that part of the conversation at all?
I think so. And I want everybody to know, like, it's not that I've just like blocked all these out and stuff. But we have so many conversations which are good through this process. I have to go back in the Rolodex of my mind and go, okay, which conversation are we talking about?
It was February of 2020.
Oh yeah, pandemic, all that kind of good stuff. But I think we just sat down and we talked about how it was going to look. Like, that I wanted to do it. I mentioned that I wanted to do it, that I had done some of my own research. I had read all of that stuff. And then we talked about, okay, what does it look like? Where do we start? Because that was my biggest thing, is I just didn't know where to start. And so we needed to have the conversation of, okay, how do we start implementing this into our relationship?
Right. And I think that is kind of what we're going to talk about next, is the steps that we used and the steps that we suggest to start implementing. First of all, how to bring up that conversation, and then how to start implementing those things into your relationship if that is something that is mutually desired.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and let me emphasize, I know you probably are already going to do this, but let me emphasize, it needs to be mutual. If this isn't a mutual thing and one of your partners, especially if I would say to all the guys listening, if your wife is not on board with this, you're just being an abuser. That's what you're doing. And if you had not been okay with this, and obviously people are saying, well, she brought it to you. Yes, but if the roles had been reversed, or at any point you would have said, I've thought this over myself and I don't want to do it, we would have dropped it.
Absolutely. And I mean, that's still the case.
Absolutely, yes. And I think that's important to emphasize to people too. Like, there is always a point for you to come to me and say, I'm not okay with this anymore.
And we're going to do a whole episode on the role of consent within domestic discipline.
Yes,
at
I
some
just
point.
wanted to bring that one thing up so that people listening would have
That's a very good point to bring up. So the first step to having this conversation, whoever is thinking about it first, is to do some research. Get some resources available that really paint a realistic picture of domestic discipline. There are a lot of fantasy sites and there are a lot of fetish sites that use terms that are used in domestic discipline that are not good resources for the reality of a domestic discipline dynamic.
By the way, I'm just going to mention, because obviously we're doing this podcast, and those of you who don't know, my lovely wife is doing her own podcast, Aria Answers, and reach out to us. Like, if you don't know where to find this stuff, reach out. I'm sure, and the podcast you're doing with Caleb, right? I'm sure he wouldn't mind if people reached out to him.
Right. So we're doing this podcast through our Patreon, but what you're referencing is I partner with Caleb, who runs the Instagram account DD Believers,
right?
And he started a Substack called Traditional Domestic Discipline, and I am featured on his Substack, and I do a podcast with him over there as well. And so that's, just a whole nother resource to go and look into.
Yeah, just reach out to people if you need to find it. You don't, if you're not sure where to start or you're having trouble finding it, I mean, reach out to people, because here's the good and bad thing about the internet, right? There's a lot out there, and the bad part is there's a lot out there. So
just sift through your resources and find resources that sound like they will fit into your life and your lifestyle. And then the next step to that is not an easy step, but it's a simple step, and that is just to have a conversation.
Mm-hmm.
Now, it was easier for us because we were already in the habit of sitting down and talking about our dynamic.
Yeah.
And so you and I were already in the habit of saying, hey, let's sit down and reevaluate things. And even now, we do that about every 6 months, where we sit down and we just reevaluate how things are going.
Is it only 6 months? I thought we did it like every 3 to 4.
It depends. It depends. I would say that this past year, we went almost a whole year, but that's just because we kind of had a year.
Yeah, we don't need to detail that, but
right.
Yeah.
2022 was not our best year, but that's okay.
It was a roller coaster. Just so you all know, it was just a roller coaster ride where some things just had to be put on the shelf temporarily to just get through the day.
But no, when we sat down in January to reevaluate and reassess, and that's when we introduced the tier system, we made a plan to sit down formally again around July.
Mm-hmm.
And so, I would say it's about every 6 months, but it can be brought up at any point.
Yeah, and I guess this would go back to what we had talked about, that these are the conversations you're gonna have to have with your partner about how often do we talk about this and reassess.
Right. So anyway, so we were already in the habit of sitting down. So it wasn't a shock for me to come to you and say, hey, can we sit down and talk about our relationship? That was not the hard part.
No.
The hard part for me was then to say, hey, what we're doing isn't working. Would you be willing to try this?
Yeah.
And once you agreed, then the next step was to decide how we were going to go about it.
Mm-hmm.
And how we decided to go about things was, and this is what I suggest to most people, is we started with like 2 rules.
Yeah, I was sorry. I was just trying to think back, going, "Wow, was it only 2?" But yeah, I think we started very, very small.
Now,
with just the 2.
The one thing that we did not do, because I did not communicate clearly, and it was not brought up, but I would actually suggest people start with establishing rules or expectations around respect and honesty and obedience. Those are kind of the 3 pillars of domestic discipline, and we did not clearly communicate about that.
No. In fact, that probably was that probably was the biggest issue when we first started. Even, I mean, the 2 rules were good, but that was the problem.
And so I really feel like we should have started with that foundation to say these are just the foundational expectations of our relationship. Because I remember there were times that I was disrespectful to you and you did not feel empowered to hold me accountable
No.
because those were not explicitly negotiated terms.
Yes.
Yet.
Yes. Right, yet. But yeah, you're absolutely right. And then so it caused a little bit of an issue again because I didn't feel I could enforce the way I needed to.
And so if I were, walking someone else through this step, I would say the first thing you do is you lay your foundation of expectations around disrespect and dishonesty and disobedience. And you really lay the foundation with that and then build on that foundation with rules, and 1 or 2 at a time. We started out with 2.
Which, again, you can start out with more, but for us, it was like make it as simple as possible. And so that's why I would encourage people to say, start out with 2 like we did. Like, again, if you want to do more, that's fine. But again, the more variables you add into this, especially when you're first doing it, the harder it might be.
I honestly would not suggest anyone do more than 3 at a time. You're getting to the point where, can you remember them? Can your partner remember them? Is there going to be consistency?
That was the part, remembering it. Yeah, absolutely.
And that's where our next tip would be, is to write it down.
Yeah.
Write it down so that you know. And one of my first rules was at bedtime because I struggled with staying up.
It's because you're a night owl.
I am a night owl and I get my best work done at night, but that makes it to where it's very hard for me to function during the day, and that was not working anymore.
And I'm terrible in the morning. At night, I'm just an afternoony guy.
And so we set up that bedtime and we had it written down. And at first we were not using the app that we use now. I was just marking down when I came to bed. And there is a level of trust there.
Yep.
That you had to trust that I was going to be honest. And
again, how honest were you?
I was actually really honest with this.
I know. That was playing devil's advocate. Everybody, I want you to know, she was very honest on that. She was.
I was, because I really wanted this to work this time. I really wanted to go all in on this. And however, we had set up in the very beginning that like for my bedtime, for every minute that I was late to bed, that it would be 1 swat with the paddle.
Yeah.
And I don't know if anyone else who has experienced a domestic discipline spanking, 1 swat is not much. And so if I was like 5 minutes late to bed, I was like, oh, that's no big deal.
Yeah. You were just going to grin and bear it. You didn't care.
Well, and yeah, absolutely. And the paddle we were using at that point, it wasn't a very effective tool.
No.
And so that was a learning curve that we had to go through. We had to go through this learning curve of finding an effective way to implement the discipline.
Yep.
And so
that took some time.
That did take time. And so we wrote everything down. We had the expectations. We set the consequences, as flawed as they were at the time. We did set the consequences. And then we said we would reevaluate after a month, I believe.
Yep.
And
so we're going to give it 30 days, see what happens.
And it was a trial period. And I believe that we also stipulated that we would talk about discipline each time it happened.
Yes, we did. Yep.
Whether that was later that night or the next day, we would talk about how it went, how we felt, so that
did it effectively work?
Right, so that you could adjust. And that's actually when I came to you. And again, there has to be a level of trust, there has to be a level of honesty, and there has to be a level of introspection on both parts for this to really work.
I would even add vulnerability.
Absolutely.
into that.
Because I had to come to you and set and tell you, hey, this isn't working because the punishment's not really that bad.
Yeah.
So even if I wanted to stay up 15 minutes later, I felt like that really wasn't too terrible. And
And yeah, I don't want to say it happened a lot, but
it happened enough.
Right. I was going to say it happened enough that we were just like, yeah, this isn't working.
Absolutely. And so we were in constant communication with that. And so we wrote everything down. We reevaluated. And after the 30 days, how did you feel about how everything was going? Because things were still not set at that point. We were still working through.
Yeah, I think if I remember, my emotion was kind of like, okay, I don't want to abandon this, because I will tell you at first, like I was almost ready to abandon it. I don't know if I ever shared that with you.
You did not.
But okay, I'm bearing my soul now. But my wife knows though that I am not somebody who quits. When I set my mind to something and I know something is beneficial, like I am not a quitter. I'm going to do everything I possibly can until I've exhausted my resources to make something work. So at that point, I wasn't ready to quit, but I was like, we still need to tweak this a lot more. Like this needs a lot more work. And I guess the only thing that was a little bit daunting is it was like I didn't realize it wasn't a subconscious. It wasn't a conscious thing. It was a subconscious thing that I maybe had been a little lazy. And I really needed to put more effort and time and I'm not sure the word that I'm searching for, care into what we were doing.
Yeah. Did you see the potential? Because I definitely did. I saw the potential even after that first 30 days of this being a asset to our relationship.
Yeah. Now I did see that. I think that was one reason why I was like, we can't quit this, because I do see some good fruits of this helping our relationship. And if we get this worked out and we continue to tweak and we work on this, this is going to be very beneficial to our dynamic and our relationship. And because this part is going to help everything else in our relationship.
However, if I could go back and tell us something in the beginning,
Oh, yeah.
I think that I would advise our younger selves I would advise the younger you to be more strict.
Yeah.
I think that you were really lax and you were really like understanding in way, because
Yeah.
let's be real, I can justify anything I do. I can justify my behavior. I can justify
Grabbing an extra Dr. Pepper. Just kidding.
I can justify almost anything, right? And you were very understanding. So if I was 5 minutes late, I'd be like, oh, I just lost track of time. Or, oh, I started getting ready for bed on time, but I didn't actually get to bed until like 10 minutes later.
Right.
And you were very understanding of those things, and you shouldn't have been. You should have drawn those boundaries a lot stricter, and you should have held me accountable.
Yeah, and I'll tell. I'm not trying to get political or philosophical when I say this, but because of the way, to a certain extent, society is with some of this stuff, I think I was afraid to overstep my bounds a little bit, and because I had been in a society where all you ever hear is, okay, men, if you act this way towards women, then you're an abuser, or you're this or that. And I had to get past this thing of, no, my wife has asked for this. It's not like something that I'm putting her under my thumb, and she has asked for me to do this. I have agreed to do this, and so it is okay. And I think I remember us having conversations with you telling me, like, I want this. This is okay. But I need you to be more strict in this if this is going to work. Like, if you're not going to do this, there's no point. If you're not going to be strict and hold me to these things, then there's no point in us doing this.
Right, and consistent.
Consistent, yeah, consistent, right.
And the next thing I would tell our younger selves is I would advise us in the beginning to not go through this system of one swat per minute or so many swats per behavior. And I think at one point we were like, okay, well, that doesn't really work. So we'll let everything accumulate and do a spanking once a week to kind of
Yeah.
clear whatever misbehavior has happened. I would have said, forego all of that because none
Yeah.
of that works.
Yeah, nope, it sure didn't. No, that's very
It didn't
true.
work for us.
Nope.
Now,
I mean, I guess it could work for some. I don't think so, but maybe it could work for somebody else.
I read online where a couple, and give me your opinion on this, but the couple had stipulated where each infraction of the wife would be 10 swats, and that's how the spanking would start. And then after those were delivered, then the husband could continue the spanking until he felt that it had been effective.
Yeah, I mean, again, I don't see anything wrong with that.
There's nothing wrong with that, but that's the
Especially
only way.
because they agreed upon it. Again,
Right.
It wasn't something where he's like, "You will do this."
Well, and so that's the only way that I think having that type of accumulation system could work.
Yes.
But for us, I would just advise us to go straight into what we eventually ended up with,
Yes.
where if I broke a standard, broke a rule, misbehaved in some way, that you basically would spank me according to how you felt the spanking should go, as long as it should go, until you felt that I was in a position to want to change my behavior.
Yeah, you've also given me feedback.
Absolutely.
Like, you give me feedback like that spanking was not near long enough.
Mm-hmm.
Like here's the good thing is I think so far I haven't had it where you're like, wow, the spanking was way too long.
No.
We have not had that. It's either been it's just right or it's too short. I'm not sure that I'm 100% learned my lesson.
And that comes from
So,
experience.
Sure, yeah, and that, but I would agree. Yeah. I mean, if anyone who's starting out, obviously listening to this and stuff, we're going to kind of take it as you're our past selves. This is exactly what we're trying to tell you is that you need to just, to a certain extent, I wish I would have just jumped in the deep end a little bit instead of putting my little toe or big toe into the water to see how cold it was. I should have just jumped in head first. I really should have.
Absolutely. And I think we should do a whole podcast about the evolution of discipline in our relationship because
Yeah.
I feel like we could talk about that for a while.
Yeah.
Is there anything that you would go back and tell our past selves?
I don't know if there's anything I would tell the past you necessarily, but the past me. I think we kind of already covered it. Other than I would just, over the years as I've gotten older, I don't know if this is a good thing or a bad thing, but I'm not as afraid to try things. I think I was a little afraid to do it, and I would just say, don't be afraid. Your wife will tell you if you've crossed the line. Jump in head first. Try to do this to the very best of your ability. She'll let you know when you've crossed the line. But what's the worst that can happen? The worst that can happen is she can come to you and say, "Yeah, I don't like the way this is working. We need to reevaluate," as opposed to just being trepidatious. And because I actually think that was worse.
Well, and I don't know if you remember this, and the details on it are a little vague to me even, but I remember having the conversation with you, and I brought it up the next day because I wasn't in a position to bring it up that night, but I brought up a punishment that had happened the previous day, and I was like, I'm not okay with what happened.
Yes, I do remember that. Yeah.
Do you want to talk about that at all?
I don't remember exactly.
I remember where we were when we had the conversation, but I don't remember the punishment or why it went wrong.
No. And gosh, and I don't either. And I don't know if that's a good thing because maybe people are like, well, how did you learn your lesson?
Well,
if you don't remember what it was, all I can tell you is that I don't think we need to remember all of those details to just know that we were both like, yeah, I did. Especially you, like that didn't work. at all. So
Well, and the reason it didn't work, I don't remember the circumstances, but the reason it didn't work was because I didn't feel validated,
right.
and I didn't feel like you gave me the opportunity. Oh, I remember what it
Oh,
was.
did it come back
I
to you?
think so. I think there was a situation where I did not feel like I should have been punished.
Yeah, it had something to do that this actually was eventually why we did the tier system, if I
Hmm.
remember correctly, because it was something that maybe didn't warrant a spanking, but I just went straight there,
Well, because at
if I
that point in our
remember.
relationship, we were like, nothing else works. Everything's a spanking. And there's nothing necessarily wrong with that, but like, wasn't necessarily a good place for us to be.
Well, yeah, because it's like getting in a car and going from 0 to 60.
Right. And so I remember I didn't think that I should have been punished for that. And you were just not going to hear me out.
Nope.
And so I remember I told you, listen, I don't have to agree. Like, if you still decide to
Go
spank
through with
me,
this, right?
I don't necessarily have to agree that the spanking is warranted, but I need to know that you heard me and that
Yes.
you considered my side of it
Yeah.
before you make your
Made the
decision.
decision. Because if I remember correctly, I didn't in that particular scenario.
You did not. And so I think it's important that before a spanking happens, that you say, let's take the bedtime rule, for instance. And if I would have been like, well, I just lost track of time, it was a mistake, I'm sorry. Even if I don't feel like I should be punished for that, if you were to come to me and be like, but what was the rule? When were you supposed to be in bed?
Well, and now that
And
we've had the tier system, we've already had that conversation.
oh yeah, we
Yeah.
have. And there has been um opportunities for us to grow and learn from that for sure.
Yeah.
And so
Yeah.
not like we've had our ups and downs, and we've had our bumps along the way for sure. Um
But really, what I would say is that to everybody listening, it's like anything in life. It is not going to be this straight line where you're not going to have hills and bumps and unpaved roads. What you have to do is you have to start on this path, realize it's going to be messy. There's going to be some times where you're going to have to clean up the mess. But the point is to keep trying. And eventually, I mean, even this tier system is working well and stuff for us, but we might find down the line, not that we need to get rid of the tier system, but we've got to tweak it even more, because this is the way it goes. We're on a path, and it's part of the path on this road is to just keep tweaking and keep working on it.
Relationships are always a progression, and you're
Right.
never really done with it. But the biggest thing that I would tell people that are starting, like just starting this, or they're finding that things aren't working and they're trying to figure out how to make them work,
And maybe they're frustrated.
be in constant communication.
Uh-huh.
Be as clear and concise as possible, and be consistent with what you've decided to do.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think maybe that's to go back to the answer the question. Tell our younger self something. Don't be afraid to communicate. I think for some reason we were just afraid to talk to each other, which sounds funny, but I think we were just afraid to talk about it.
Definitely. And I think that we've grown in that area. I can still know from my end that there's times where it is difficult to communicate still.
Me too.
And so we're continuing to grow in that area. But that would be my final takeaway with all of this is have the conversation, be as honest as possible, present factual information to your partner, let them sit with that and come to a decision on their own. And then if you do move forward and try to incorporate domestic discipline into your relationship, be in communication, be consistent.
Yeah. Yeah. I guess the only way that I would sum it up is remember that you're in the relationship that you have with your partner. This is why some relationships fail, because in general, because people don't communicate, they don't do what they said that they're going to do. Don't be afraid. This is the most intimate relationship that we have is our marriage. I don't have, obviously, or at least hopefully, right? I don't have this type of relationship with anybody but you. So who can I be vulnerable and honest to if it's not you? And it should be you. And so that's why you need to not be afraid to just go to your spouse and say, okay, we need to talk about this, and be very open and honest to try to fix this, whatever it is.
Right, because at the end of the day, our marriage is going to stay intact. So even if I were to come to you in that initial conversation and say, are you willing to do this? And if your immediate response was like, no, I can't do that, we would have figured something else out. Our
Yeah.
relationship was not going anywhere.
No, no. And yeah, and I'm not going to lie, has some of this been a little hard for me? But yeah, but the more you do it and the more consistent you get and the more you tweak it, the easier it gets. At first, it is a little overwhelming, but you just have to start small, as we've already talked about, and work your way up.
And my only other takeaway to tell our audience and to tell ourselves really is use resources to gain knowledge, but be careful not to compare yourself. The
Yeah.
way you the way you conduct your relationship and the way domestic discipline looks for you is going to be unique to your relationship.
Yes.
You don't have to do domestic discipline like anybody else. Take what works for you, use it in your relationship, and let your relationship be the guide, not someone else's relationship, not someone else's writings, not someone else's experience.
Yeah, obviously, like you said, borrow from those things, but at the end of the day, it's between you and your spouse, and you have to decide what works for you guys.
Yep. So I think that is basically where we're going to stop it today, because we could
could go
rabbit
on.
hole. We could totally rabbit hole.
I tried not to
trail.
do any of those in this first one, but I think I maybe chased a few. Sorry.
A few, but not bad. Anyway, we have really enjoyed this conversation. We hope that you have as well, and we're excited to be starting this podcast.
Yeah,
and
we're
to
gonna
be continuing it.
Speaking of the journey, we're gonna see where this takes us.
Yeah. So, and we hope that you guys come along with us, and we'd love your feedback. And like I said, we have a Instagram account for this podcast called the_disciplined life, all one word, second word there. And, of course, we'll have that typed out for you in the description box. And if you want to follow my personal Instagram, it is in my proper place with a period between each word. So in period, my period, proper period, place. And if you have any questions, want to contact us directly, feel free to send us a DM, and we will talk to you guys next time.
See you in the next one.
Bye.